head as individuals around the size of these numbers. But we've become so very good at basically efficiently making things and not seeing the impacts. A couple of good books that really talk about this. And one I think that we're experiencing, at least the beginnings of this trajectory today, is this whole notion of, will we ever get to $20 a gallon? And the author of this book, Kusz Steiner, it's a very well-written book, reads like a story, but it's optimistic at the end of the day, because he says as we move from $6 through $14 through $20 a gallon, we're going to see significant changes in lifestyle. And it's going to drive, it's going to force innovation. Because you have two choices. You can innovate and change significantly, or you can die off. I mean, those are the two choices we have if we don't deal with this energy crisis we have. And I think it's going to have some very, very rapid and significant changes that are going to be imposed upon us by the reality that we face in the next 5 to 10 years, and probably within the next 5 years. So, having talked about fluids, foods, fibers, and fuels, they come from these three sources: flora, fauna, and fossils. And I look at fossil as a source of water. People say, well, water is not a fossil. And I can argue that it's a fluid, but it's also a fossil in that no one's making any more of it, and it came from a source eons ago. Most of our water came from other planets, according to the latest theories. So it's not being produced, it's not a renewable resource, it's just a resource that keeps getting used and cycled. And the challenge with regard to water is managing it and keeping it clean. That's the real challenge. And we haven't done a very good job at managing and, in particular, keeping water clean. So those are the three sources. And if you look at these, this is where you get into the, again, trying to create a structured way of thinking about this. If you say, okay, these are the general uses: fluids, foods, fibers, and fuels, and the only sources are flora, fauna, and fossil, or fossil-like realities, under which I put water. You begin to see the fact that now we're running into a limited dynamic, because if we have resources that can offer both food and fuel, like flora, if you're looking at oils produced from ethanol and soy oil and the like, now we're looking at a serious conflict. Now, it becomes something that is very, very quickly exacerbated, not only by the dynamics of demand, but the dynamics of speculation. And in a world where you have control over commodities from the function of speculation, you create very, 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 very wide gaps in terms of equity situations. Not only within the society, but from one state to the other. Within the society, when those equities grow very radically, again, this has been written about widely by sociologists like Saul Alinsky at the University of Chicago. Once you get that gap, you create the potential for failed state. And we're beginning to see that in places that we hadn't thought about that happening in the recent past. So the issue is, how might we avoid collapse? Jared Diamond wrote about this a few years ago, and he looked at societies where collapse had occurred, but he also looked at a few societies that had been somehow resilient enough to prevent their collapse. And he was looking for what are the keys to societies that prevent collapse. And he looked at, interestingly enough, he looked at countries like Sweden, countries like Japan, where in the case of Japan, they're an island nation, and they learned very quickly that they had a limited scope of resources to manage, and they began to manage those resources. They were almost deforested, and they reforested the island several hundreds of years ago, and they continue to do that. There's nothing perfect about any of the societies that he talks about, but he's trying to get indications as to what a society might do from a structural perspective, or in today's language, from a policy perspective. How might we set policies up so that we preserve and conserve the environment that in fact supports us? I think one of the best quotes I have found from Buckminster Fuller was to make the world work for 100% of humanity in the shortest possible time through spontaneous cooperation without ecological offense or damage to anyone. That's a mouthful, but that's a pretty good personal mission. Actually, it's a pretty good corporate mission, because if you begin to think as a business that 100% of humanity, you change that a little bit in the way you think about humanity, you say, well, that's 100% of the market. All right, I've got to solve a problem for 100% of the market. I can't think about just solving a problem for 20 or 10% of the market, because that market's going to disappear in a competitive environment. We're beginning to see that. Once you satisfy 10 or 20% of the market, you're out of business. All right, you really have no growth potential. If you start solving problems for 100% of the market, you have to redesign your business model. And that's an area that I'm really interested in looking at. How do you significantly redesign a business model so that what you're doing as an entity, whether you're an incorporated business, whether you're an NGO, whether you're a B Corp, which is a new form of corporation that's developing, how do you solve the problem for 100% of humanity? If you start that way, you begin to think about solutions very, very differently. Because your price points are obviously very different to start. What's important changes in terms of what the market is demanding. And if you can solve a problem for 100% of humanity, that's real innovation. So it's really about policies. The other person, or persons that have written about this, and this is a book I got through this book very quickly. Has anyone read this book, Spirit Level? This is a book that really talks about the issue of equity, and to put it in a nutshell, what these two researchers, Wilkinson and Pickett, learned in their research. They did a meta-study. So they studied a lot of studies around the world, and they learned largely that happiness or contentment, satisfied lives, were had in countries where the gap between the richest and the poorest was the narrowest. And the countries that had the least amount of happiness, the most amount of dissent, potential revolution, were the countries where the gap was the greatest. And some of the things that they measured were basically based on UN parameters like health, trust, life expectancy, infant mortality, obesity, education, pregnancies, homicides, the standard stuff that we want to have good metrics on. And most countries have some metrics on these, so they were able to study it. They took this to another level. They said, well, how do we prove this theory? We can't go to another world and find another world full of countries and see if we get the same result if we look at it. They went and they said, well, the closest thing we can find is a country that's got a lot of states, the United States, the 50 states of the United States. And they looked at the numbers for each state in terms of, again, comparing one state to the other as opposed to one country to the other. And they found very significant correlation between their country study and the state study. So they found that the states with the highest level of happiness, contentment, low crime, high life expectancy. Can anyone guess what states were the highest?
Minnesota?
I'm sorry?
Minnesota?
Minnesota wasn't up there. Vermont was up there.
Yeah.
Maine was up there.
Yeah.
Actually, North Dakota was up there. All right. Which states were the lowest?
New York,
The
probably.
last three lowest.
Illinois, and
No,
Michigan.
Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana.
No, that is other states.
Oh.
All right. And that was really an eye-opener.
Yeah.
Because they said, well, the issue here is if you're looking to have a healthy economy and have, an environment in which you want to live, it doesn't matter how wealthy you are. It matters how close the best paid or the wealthiest person is to the least wealthy person. And how do you make that happen in a policy sort of way?
The other day I had a
All right?
public radio comment about $80,000 would be contentment level.
Right.
That's
There's a
big.
level of
Yeah.
contentment.
Beyond that, it is
Beyond that is
again, it's misery.
exactly.
And below that is misery.
Exactly. So I think that's one of the, and I'll stop here, but I think if we're looking for sustainability, we have to get to the root of the issue.
Yes.
And we can do all the resource management we want, we can do all the all the development of, getting nano